Imagine, just for a second, a man whose daily physical life was so microscopic, so obsessively and terrifyingly neurotic, that he basically lived like a literal machine. Yet his intellect was so incredibly vast that it completely shattered our understanding of reality itself. Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to dissect the bizarre, darkly comedic, and deeply psychological contrast of history's most precise mind, Immanuel Kant.
Picture the 18th century seaport of Königsberg. It's a freezing afternoon, and you need to know the time. But you don't look up at a clock tower, right? No, you just look out your window. Because if you spot this frail, tiny man in a tailored coat methodically marching down the street, you know exactly what time it is, 3:30 p.m. Down to the absolute second. The citizens literally set their pocket watches by this man's hyper-punctual, unyielding afternoon walk.
Part 1. The Clockwork Philosopher. Now, despite having this massive reality-bending influence on the entire globe, legend has it that Kant never traveled more than 60 miles from this bustling seaport where he was born, raised, and eventually died. Honestly, he was essentially a human houseplant. He required a highly specific, totally predictable, temperature-controlled environment just to survive.
This brings us to part 2, a life by the minute. To really understand this absolutely rigid routine, you have to understand the man himself. Kant was under 5 feet tall. He had a sunken chest, and he was so physically delicate that he actually needed specialized mechanical fasteners just to keep his clothes from slipping off his narrow shoulders. So, what was his defense mechanism against all this physical frailty? An unyielding, almost clinical mania. At 5 a.m., he woke up. He had exactly 2 cups of tea, exactly 1 pipe. At 7 a.m., he lectured. At 1 p.m., he had his one solid meal for the day. At 3:30 p.m., the famous walk. And he did this completely alone, by the way, because he was genuinely terrified that opening his mouth to speak would let cold air into his fragile lungs. And finally, by 10 p.m., he was wrapped tightly in his blankets like a silkworm. Every single day. But look, a ruthless routine requires a ruthless enforcer. Enter Martin Lamp, his servant of 40 years. Every single morning, without fail, Lamp marched in and declared, "Master, master." And Kant actually gave Lamp strict orders to tolerate zero hesitation or malingering from Kant himself. The philosopher was quite literally a prisoner to a clockwork system of his own design, and Lamp was his hired warden, making sure he never, ever strayed from the machinery of his routine. Let's look at part 3, the boundless mind. So, you're probably wondering, why on earth would anyone subject themselves to this? Well, it was because of the sheer, terrifying scale of his intellect. Think about this contrast for a second. Here is a frail man who refused to sweat or even listen to music, permanently trapped in this tiny geographic bubble. Yet, in 1755, this obscure 31-year-old formulated the origin of the solar system. He proposed it formed from the gravitational pull of atoms. He was bounded in a literal nutshell, yet counted himself the king of infinite space. And then, in 1781, came his 800-page masterpiece, The Critique of Pure Reason. Kant was diving into these dizzying, chaotic philosophical abysses. He argued that human understanding actually structures all of our experience. He was saying that space, time, and causality aren't real things just floating out there in the void, but they are the literal framework of the human mind itself. He wasn't just observing reality, guys. He was rewriting its underlying source code. Which leads us to part 4, the philosophy of duty. You see, Kant's personal obsession with strict, unbending rules wasn't just some quirky lifestyle choice. It actually became the absolute bedrock of modern ethics. He developed what he called the categorical imperative. He basically believed that morality didn't come from, divine clouds or messy human emotions. He thought it came purely from cold, hard reason. An absolute unconditional duty, an unbreakable law. Kind of exactly like his rule to wake up at 5 a.m. no matter what. This duty-based ethics is entirely uncompromising. The idea is this: act only on rules that you would want everyone in the entire world to follow all the time. Treat humans as inherently valuable, never just as tools to get what you want. Act as a lawmaker in a perfectly rational society. It's incredibly logical, it's flawlessly structured, and it is completely intolerant of exceptions, which is, frankly, the exact morality you'd expect from a guy who lived his entire life by the minute. Moving into part 5, the servant's dynamic and decline. But here's the thing. Humanity is inherently messy, isn't it? After 40 years of flawlessly enforcing Kant's clockwork life, his servant, Martin Lampe, began to drink heavily. So in 1802, Kant was forced to do the unthinkable. He fired his human metronome.
The trauma to Kant's highly regulated mind was so severe that, in a moment of incredibly dark, tragic irony, he wrote a strict new rule in his notebook to force his own brain into compliance. He wrote, "The name Lampe must now be completely forgotten."
And you can probably guess what happened next. With the machine broken, the man broke too. Dementia crept in and entirely dismantled his disciplined life. He started forgetting his friends. He abandoned his carefully measured vegetables and just began gorge-eating bread, butter, and English cheese. He developed gout. The frail human houseplant had finally been exposed to the chaotic elements of real life, and his body rapidly gave out. He died in 1804.
Finally, Part 6, The Architecture of Reason. So, we have to ask, why did history's most brilliant philosopher live like a captive machine? Well, it wasn't because he lacked imagination. It was actually because his imagination was so dangerously expansive. His hyper-regimented routine was a psychological defense mechanism. He basically had to build an utterly boring, perfectly predictable physical reality to act as an anchor. It kept his mind safely tethered while it was out there exploring the terrifying, chaotic limits of human reason. Today, his legacy is permanently etched into the modern world, as we see here in Königsberg, but it really stands as a fascinating testament to the heavy, almost ironic price of absolute intellectual freedom. To permanently change the way humanity thinks, Kant had to sacrifice the spontaneity of actually living. His famous epitaph perfectly captures this bizarre duality. It reads, "Two things filled the mind with ever-increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me." The vast cosmic reach of his ideas perfectly contrasted with the unyielding prison of his internal rules. So it really leaves you wondering, what kind of genius could you unlock if you turned your own daily life into a flawless, unfeeling machine? And more importantly, would it even be worth the price?